Hello and welcome to today's webcast presented by the American Association of Cardiovascular and Pulmonary Rehabilitation. Today's presentation is titled Building Authentic Patient Partnerships, the Secret to Innovation in Your Practice. My name is Hannah and I'm on the education team for AACVPR and I'll be assisting as today's moderator. Before we get started, a few quick housekeeping notes. You'll notice that the lines have been muted today. However, this is an interactive presentation, so please stay tuned for a few polls, as well as opportunities for Q&A with the presenter at the end of the session. We have allowed time to address your questions, so please feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation today. At this time, I'm going to turn things over to AACVPR's immediate past president, Tom Draper, to kick things off.
Hello, everyone. Wanted to welcome everyone and introduce our speaker today, Greg Merritt. I have the very fortunate pleasure to have known Greg for the past couple of years. I did not know him when I was at Michigan, but I've gotten to know him since and have really come to appreciate what Greg can provide us as individuals who work in cardiac and pulmonary rehab, but really the passion that Greg truly has. So just a little bit about Greg. He is a patient. He will tell you his story, so I will not go into that. But Greg has a PhD in higher education from Michigan State University. He worked at the University of Michigan as a senior housing director for 18 years. And as you'll hear a lot about, has shifted his passion to really being a patient advocate and a patient partner. So why do we have this webcast today? Why has AACVPR done this? Well, first of all, as I said, I've gotten to know Greg, and Greg's gotten to know many of us in AACVPR leadership, and we really feel incredibly passionate about how we need to listen to our patients, not just in the transaction of clinical care, but we need to listen to our patients and partner with our patients when it comes to truly redesigning our programs, comes to truly really developing how we deliver the care of cardiac and pulmonary rehab. And with all the stuff we've been talking about over the past couple of years, there's no better time to partner with our patients and listen to their voices and their perspectives, because truly, as a saying that I typically use goes, nothing about me without me, meaning nothing about me as a patient without including me in that decision-making process. So Greg's going to talk about how to incorporate patients into councils and other things. Greg's going to talk about how you do that, and also how it can really transform how you run your cardiac and pulmonary rehab programs. I've been fortunate to do a lot of that work here where I'm at the Sanger Heart and Vascular Institute in Charlotte. We've actually developed a patient family advisory council that is over our whole institute, and we have patients that are involved in our committees with regards to space planning, our quality committees, our continuum of care committees, and many of the patients that we have for our whole institute actually come from our cardiac rehab program because they have the most insight as far as what happens within within healthcare. They're very intersected with our programs, but they're very knowledgeable. And so every time that we look for a new project or a redesign, or just really talking about processes and care delivery, we want to bring in our patients. So with that, I just wanted to start it off and kick it off and just emphasize AACVPR support of Greg and many of you that are trying to do this within your own programs, and really just emphasize how important we feel this is as you move forward with your program. So with that, Greg, the show is all yours.
Well, thanks very much, Tom and Hannah. It is an incredible pleasure for me to do this, and I couldn't thank the AACVPR leadership enough. I also want to thank all the attendees who are out there. I know that you're doing the good work and the work that I will and often do celebrate and tell everybody about. And I know that an hour of your time is a valuable hour, and so I'll do my best to try to keep us both engaged and do something that's useful during our time. As Hannah said, you'll see the title there. The question is on purpose. I'm hoping it's the secret to your innovation in your practice. I don't know this for a fact, but certainly the things that I've been involved with at the University of Michigan, which I'll talk about, has begun to think about ways in which we innovate what it is each practice can do. I have added this GP. One of the things I've noticed about healthcare, people love titles. So I'm not a general practitioner, but I am a grateful patient, and I hope to actually see many more GPs after this webcast, so that you all can begin to celebrate other folks. You'll also just see my information about both the webpage that I have, and then I'd appreciate anybody who wants to keep learning and keep thinking together with me, join any of these social media platforms that I'm just now launching and becoming a part of. So let's jump right in. So I'm going to tell, as Tom said, I'm going to talk about my story and how I found myself in this journey, which I didn't actually predict I would find. I was going to spend time telling my own story, and then I thought, you're going to probably hear enough of me, so I should probably have somebody else who actually remembers the experience tell this. And so I'm going to shift over and talk, have my bride and I, who did a story with our local channel news, Channel 4 News in Detroit. That actually is me. I can prove it at some point by putting the camera on that the same guy who's there is still talking to you today. I have no idea why I'm number one there, but that's 4 days after the incident, and so let's watch together.
It's a ride Greg doesn't remember and one his wife will never forget. What started as an ordinary Saturday morning suddenly became a race to save his life.
Dr. Frank McGeorge is here with a couple's story of survival.
They've been married for 16 years, but Greg Merritt still refers to his wife, Michelle, as my bride. She's also his hero for helping save his life one fateful February day.
February 25th, 2012, I wake up at 6:30, 7 o'clock, say to my bride, hey, I think I have heartburn.
And I was like, oh, you don't have heartburn. And you certainly don't have it in the morning when you first wake up. And he said, I had a bout of heartburn yesterday, too.
Michelle is a veterinary oncologist, and her training told her something just didn't seem right, especially knowing Greg had a family history of heart attack.
I, being the classic good male that I am, said, oh, I don't think we need to go to the hospital now.
Greg admits he had a golf fitting he didn't want to miss.
And I was like, no, I think we should. And I even asked him, twice, do you think we should take an ambulance? And he thought that was just completely silly.
Instead, they started driving to the ER at the University of Michigan.
And I was going really fast, and he looked over at me and he said, beautiful, I'm fine, slow down, everything is going to be fine.
But suddenly, it's not.
And he was white as a ghost, and he was sweating profusely. So I knew that he was going into cardiac arrest.
Greg's heart had stopped beating.
So I just thought I just needed to get him to the hospital as fast as I could. Saying to him, Greg, I love you, I love you, I love you. I'm doing the best I can. I'm trying to get you there as fast as I can get you there. And I thought to myself, Michelle, if you get into a car accident, nobody's going to make it.
They make it to the hospital where staff races to help, but Greg's heart isn't restarting.
The attending clinician came up to me and said, we've done CPR for about 20 minutes. The likelihood of him coming back, or if he does come back being a functional person, is really low at this point. And do you want us to stop CPR?
She asked them to keep trying.
And after about 5 minutes, they actually did get his heart rate back and things like that. They sent him down to the cath lab, and they put 2 stents into his heart.
Doctors use a high-tech hypothermia treatment to cool Greg's body.
There's a 3-day period that I don't know what he's going to be like.
But when he wakes up...
That was largely what happened. I couldn't quite believe that a 46-year-old guy who was in relative good health could have something like this happen to him.
I have always said Greg is like the luckiest person that I know. Within a couple of days, he was pretty much back to normal, which is truly unheard of.
In spite of the outcome, Michelle has struggled with post-traumatic stress from the decisions she made that day. Her advice to others?
Absolutely 100% call 911 if there's any concern and get an ambulance.
Greg urges others not to brush off their own red flags.
It was likely signaling me to say, now's the time to go. You have these little nags of some sort of pain going on. Best thing to do is to go get this checked out.
Greg is now determined to pay it forward. He's embarked on a second career to help patients play a more meaningful role in their own health care. His website, Patient is Partner, sums up his vision. He is forever grateful to the medical staff at U of M and says, without Michelle...
So there's no way I survive. And so I couldn't be more grateful for what she's done.
And that's where you see me in the picture there. And ultimately, what gets me thinking about this entire experience, which is to think about, now that this experience has just happened, I am really grateful that I'm still alive and still here and still have a second chance at life. And so what should I do with this second life opportunity? I began right away to try to figure out how can I show my gratitude to what took place with the medical field that helped me, with an ultimate opportunity to be able to do that with the cardiac rehab folks. And so I just want to do a quick thing so we can do some interact, but I'm going to do some kind of who's here. So I'm going to open up a poll here and launch it and see if you can tell me who's in the room, if you will. So I will launch this and give you an opportunity to vote and figure out what percentage of folks are here from different places. Okay, that's an interesting percentage, 92%, or maybe you voted twice and you're in both places, which would make more sense to me. That's I could see why that could happen. Okay, I think we probably got most of us there, so a good percentage of cardiac rehab and probably some others in pulmonary rehab. Let's try one more here and see who you are. As best as this thing, and it doesn't fit, my apologies, but the poll only allows for 5 options, and so let's figure out who might be a part of the group here. Okay. Well, with 80% of the vote in, it's lots of EP nurses and program directors and managers maybe playing both roles. Few social workers. Love that there's a patient. That'll be an important part of this experience. Okay, well that's helpful to me because it in part shows us that those are the 2 places where I hope we, and I think everybody can get something out of this, but places that are really important to me in terms of my experience in cardiac rehab. So let's think about and talk about what it is that we're going to do today. So here's my plan for the next 40 minutes or so. What I'm going to propose is, I think, something that may be different than expected, or at least I hope will start a conversation, a movement, maybe even nudge you to a new approach. And that's really to think about patients in a very different kind of way than you typically do day in and day out. All the wonderful work you do with patients and changing their lives and giving them second lives is certainly a critical component. But this is an opportunity to rethink that relationship and to do things differently. Okay, so I'm going to use the word patient here. I want to be really clear that what I really mean is this much broader term of patient and their caregivers, loved ones, care partners, the folks, the friends, the folks who are with them, who are partners in their care as well. So I say that for an important point as we go along and thinking about what role they might have in helping you to be successful in your work. I want to raise the notion, and I'll say this a number of times, that though there are many wonderful things, the research is really clear about how wonderful cardiac rehab, and again, I'm going to spend most of my energies in cardiac rehab, and my apologies to the pulmonary folks. I think you'll get something out of this, but I know I've experienced cardiac rehab. I've not done pulmonary rehab, although my father-in-law, who has COPD, has just finished a treatment of pulmonary rehab, so I do have some experience in this. But I'm going to spend lots of time thinking about the concerns that exist in the field, much of which you all know, from all the materials in the Road to Reform to the moving from 20 to 70% in the Million Hearts Collaborative. And so I want you to have that in the back of your mind in terms of, okay, those are challenges that face us as a field. And then I also I'm going to ask you a number of times to think about challenges and issues that exist in your personal programs and your facilities. And so that's what I mean by patients, and then or by issues. And then I want you to think about the idea that there are also a number of us grateful patients who want to help and have loads of expertise. And what I mean by expertise is, and I'll say this a number of times, they aren't just experts about themselves, although that's a really critical component to this. They are also experts in multiple fields, in multiple academic disciplines, in multiple life stories, in multiple identities. And so, and there are a number of them, and you all know them, who are grateful. It's also really important that you try to figure out how might I authentically invite them to help solve those problems we just talked about on the last slide that face the field or your program. And so what we're going to spend our time and energy during the next 40 minutes is to really think about how to do that. And my guess is for many of you, even more work that's done, even places that Tom described, that it's beyond the Patient Family Advisory Council, well, that's important, but this can be new and it can be innovative, and that's a great thing, but it also means it might be scary. I often hear, but there's no reason for us to change. We're already too busy. We don't have time for this kind of thing. And more importantly, our leadership or our patients love us just the way we are. So why in the world would we want to be changing if we're already successfully doing what we're doing today? So here's the agenda and where we're going to spend our time. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what it means to authentically partner with patients. And so I've come up with this 5 T's, partly because it's easy for me to remember what the T letters were, but most importantly that it becomes a memorable thing to think about as you're trying to partner with your patients. I want to talk a little bit about how might you find these patients or caregivers who would be great partners. I spend a little time on, okay, so I know patients and they agree to partner, now what? And I'm going to talk specifically about some examples of things that I've done with my great colleagues and friends at the University of Michigan's Cardiac Rehab program. And then I'll talk about some ideas that I'd like you to try as soon as possible, and why this is all can be a challenge, that it sounds great, and I often hear that's a really good idea and we can't do it. And we'll talk a little about those challenges as well. So let me jump into the notion of partnerships. I had thought a number of, over the last year and a half or so, there have been lots of conversations about partnering with patients in healthcare, and that this is a possibility. And I started thinking about, boy, when we think about the word partner, what are the words that best describe good partners? And I try to think about that from issues in business, in relationships in marriages, in sports. And so this was my crack at thinking about, as you consider grateful patients that might be wonderful partners, what are the components that you're going to need to have? So the first is teammates. So certainly this is true in sports. And how I mean teammates is that we've got to be good teammates, not just in our care, but in the way in which we think about what expertise exists in both of us. So what I presumed and turned out to be a reality is that the folks in cardiac rehab who went from my case manager to the interns to anybody else that I ran into there, they had tremendous expertise about my condition, about the heart, all the ways in which your programs are successful in assuring that there's expertise and knowledge that exists there. The other thing is also true that there are always 2 experts in that teammates process. That's the role that happens for the provider. For the patient, I knew I was expert in me. And so you could do a lot of things to ask me to do stuff. And if I knew that in spite of the wonderful advice I got from the dietitian about what I'm going to do, it's going to take a lot for me to get rid of my bacon because I really like bacon. And I could say that I'm going to do that, but the reality would be I'd probably just tell you that as a lie to make you feel good. And then I'd go home and say, well, I think it's okay to have a little bacon, isn't it? That's the kind of thing. So I'm an expert about me. But also your patients, as you get to know them, are expert about a lot of other things. Again, from their own careers. In both cardiac and pulmonary rehab, you both see lots of retired folks who have done incredible things in the profession. And how often do you get a chance to think about what expertise they might have to help you with your facility or your practice? The second T really I think about a lot is this notion of transparency. And one of the things I see in healthcare, in part due to regulations, in part due to, I think, the ways in which we're trained, is that we sort of eradicate the notion of the human in human medicine. And we aren't transparent in developing a relationship about what it means to connect with another human being. I hear often a friend of mine talks about the notion of that we tend to think about healthcare and coming to get services as that we have been told to come to there. But he looks at this and says, hey, I'm inviting you into my life. I'm the one who had the cardiac event. And so what if we flip the way we think about things and become much more transparent about, you've been invited into my life because I'm the one who has this vulnerable experience of having this cardiac event that took place. And so what I mean by transparency is that how do we get to know each other even better than we do now? And I get that there are real lines of professionalism that need to exist. But I can tell you from my own experience, one of the best parts about creating the sort of connection that I made there was getting to know Carla and who she is as a person, that she loves dogs, that I have also 3 dogs, that I'm married to a veterinarian, that I work at the university. Those relationships are really important in being transparent. And I think actually in the roles of cardiac and pulmonary rehab, you all have the best opportunity to think about how to become much more transparent to patients. The third T is really about the notion that there are always 2 teachers in the room when we think about educating. And again, I'll go back to the notion of experts. And so there are lots of things that really good programs think a lot about in terms of assuring that there's patient education needed and required for patients to get better. And I think that's true, and I think you need to figure out all the ways in which patients are going to continue to learn about their illness, about what it is that's going to take for them to thrive after their incident, etc. But it's also true that you could be a learner in thinking about how is it that you provide opportunities for the patient to be the teacher. How is it that you ask the right kind of questions, create a culture of curiosity in your program that assures that patients have an opportunity to teach as well as to learn. These 3 T's sort of build up to the notion that if we're going to create authentic partnerships with our patients and their families, we're going to need to have what is inevitably this notion of trust. And so that requires us, again, to get to know people beyond what is far too often sort of the factory or business nature of too much of healthcare, in my view. I hear words like efficiency and what are the numbers and the data and the financial numbers more so than I hear what does it mean to really care and get to know deeply someone whose life has been upended because of an incident that took place 2 weeks earlier. And so the more we can spend time getting to know each other and creating this sort of value of trust, the better. The 5th T is really about something that, again, I think cardiac and pulmonary programs are much more beneficial than others in that when I go to see my cardiologist, I probably average somewhere between 4 and 6 minutes to be able to see him. Whereas I got a chance during the 36 sessions I did of cardiac rehab to spend an inordinate amount of time and getting to know, again, not just my case manager, but the interns and the other staff who were there, and then ultimately invited to be a part of a advisory council and got the chance to see even more folks, including the program manager, et cetera. So time is a really critical notion of authentically partnering, spending time and getting to know folks. So I raised, this is not a 6T, it's actually the idea that in spite of the fact that those 5 T's make good sense, and most people that I talk to say, yeah, that sounds really good, Greg, it still results in a lot of tensions that exist because there are lots of ways in which people will say, that sounds like it's the right thing to do, but there's all kinds of reasons why it's a challenge for us. And so those tensions exist. I'll acknowledge them. We'll talk a little about them as we move through the webcast, but I just wanted to raise this is that I'm acknowledging that this is not just easy to say, hey, you just give these 5 T's, you start doing them, and it'll be fine tomorrow. Let's turn now and think a little about how to find grateful and willing patients. I suspect this is, so one of the things I've noticed about healthcare is you are very data-driven, quantity, efficiency programs, and if you ask most people in healthcare, they would start by saying, well, if we're going to find patients to be part of our PFAC, we need an application process, we need a judging criteria, we need to actually have a series of things we're going to have, and 14 years later, you would have a process that you'd feel good about in terms of vetting the right kind of patients to be sure that they're a part of what you have. But I have another way to think about this that I'm wondering if you'll allow me an opportunity to just think through this, and it's partly about my own thing. So this is where I want you to really sort of take paper and pencil if you would, or have something. I'm going to ask you to do this a number of times. So Rather than to think about that it's hard to find grateful patients, let's think about this in reverse. So let's talk about the idea of what are some specific challenges that face your practice. So you might write down everything from our enrollment isn't as good as it should be, our patients are leaving, our facility is really terrible, we need to have more money, we've got to have, there are lots of challenges that might keep you up at night, and I want you to keep thinking about that. Also want you to think at the same time about how might a new perspective from someone who has experienced your program, patients, caregivers, help look at that from a new perspective. And thirdly, if you have these challenges, do you already have a group of staff working on this? Or are there already times in the schedule that have been made to say who can be working on this together? Or if you're a single practice and you're trying to, how much have you thought about how to try to solve the issues that exist in your programs? And then I want you to, at the same time as you got that on one side, think of yourself, okay, when I think about my favorite patient, who comes to mind? Maybe a patient or two who pops right into the mind right away. They're front and center. They may be patients you're working with right now. They may be patients who experienced cardiac rehab 5 years ago, but they're patients who pop right into mind. What might happen if you would call them and you said to them, hey, I've got this issue we've been really struggling with. I've loved our working together. We had lots of opportunities to engage, and I would love to explore your expertise and your perspective. And so to optimize that for the best experience, I would have you think from a patient's perspective in two ways. So I'd want you to do this in such a way that says, yes, there's an opportunity for the patient to experience your program, and they've already done that, and they can help you to get better at that program. But I'd also have you ask them to put on an additional hat, that if they worked for FedEx and a logistics company, to think about it from that perspective. If they're an engineer, to think about how an engineer would solve the problem. Because one of the things that we'd learned about innovation is innovation comes typically not from those who are in the field trying to solve the problem, but actually from disciplines to the left or the right that come in and ask very different questions or look at the perspective from such a different lens. And so I'd ask you to think about how you might set that experience up by sitting and talking with them about ways in which their experience could be helpful. So let me get a little practical about this and talk about this from my experience. As Tom said, I've worked in education all of my career, and so I'll talk about how each of these things resulted in changes that took place at what is now Michigan Medicine at the University of Michigan. And you'll see on the slide a number of folks that I can't stop. Want to be sure to draw your attention to that, because these credits to Patrick Walden and Diana and Carolyn and Joe, Stephen, Teresa, Carla, Sandy are really important folks for me to point out, because when you find patients, you're going to see that they're grateful for the opportunity to work with and with these individuals. So again, thanks to all of them. So I'll give you 6 examples and then talk about some future things. So I want to start by thinking about how I first got involved. So when I first got involved, how I got involved was Teresa, who was the program manager at the time, simply came up to me. I was probably in my, I don't know, 10th session or so, and I was working on the bike, and she came down and sat next to me and said, you know, somebody had suggested that I come and talk with you about the opportunity to do this new advisory council that we're going to be putting together, and we'd love to have patients be a part of it. And one of the first, and I heartily said yes to that and was very pleased to be a part of it. And part of what we wanted to do was to take a look at something that is maybe unique or partially unique to the University of Michigan, in that we wanted to look at what they were doing there as group orientation for incoming phase 2 patients. And I'll be, you know, I was always and probably still remain suspicious that phase 2 group orientation, though, has wonderful power. My guess is it goes back to the sort of factory notion of healthcare, and it's much more efficient to do many patients than others, but I found this to be a wonderful opportunity to do some change in it. So when I first went there, the orientation was essentially these big booklets, not booklets, they were big binders given to each patient, and there were probably 6 or 7 of us that day. I arrived, and I'm nothing but nervous because I had just had the experience that you didn't get to see on the video of this cardiac event that took place. And what happens during that orientation is that we open up the booklet and we begin to fill out paperwork, which is the experience that many of us who go to health care appointments do. You all are wonderful at making sure that we've filled out the proper paperwork. And again, I want to get back to the human part of human medicine. And so they ask, well, what do you think about this orientation? And so one of the things that we talked about and I worked specifically on is to say, I think you've got to get rid of the binders. We've got to get rid of the filling out the paperwork as a part of orientation. I had spent my, again, career working with 18-year-olds who were frightened coming into new residence halls and began to think about, this is an opportunity to think about frightened 50 to 80-year-olds who show up at orientation worried about whether their life is going to go on the way they knew it before. And so we changed orientation to be a place where we could connect with those patients right away by sharing their cardiac event story. Now, it wasn't required, but now that we've done this for a number of years, it's clear that this has a bonding experience for those of us who come into orientation and grounds that. We also had a group of patients who worked on a PowerPoint that would be given to orientation that was literally created by the patients to share with other patients. And so that's an opportunity to engage those folks. So that was phase one of, or part one of that orientation. I'll talk in the last one about what we're doing today about that. The second opportunity came at the opportunity to be invited as a part of that advisory board to present at AACVPR about what we're doing. That had a number of positive benefits, I think, for Michigan medicine as much as it did for those of you who may have come to some of those sessions in the past, in that it created this sense of buy-in on both parts. So partly on me and saying, how might I be helpful as a patient advocate to continue to support and raise awareness and increase the value of what it means to engage your patients. And secondly, to have an opportunity for the folks at Michigan Medicine to have staff who begin to buy in, which will be a critical component of this being successful. The third thing that I want to talk about is that I was asked to be a part of a re-envisioning of the individual treatment plan that all of you, as I understand, love. Couldn't, you would hope that you could do more of those, not just every 30 days, but every 2 days, said tongue firmly stuck in cheek. So I was asked to be a part of this and heartily agreed to try to be helpful in that. But it's a good example of one that actually didn't work as well as we could have. And it didn't work, I think, in two ways. So in part, I wasn't sure what it is that I was getting into. For example, I actually didn't know I had an individualized treatment program, not because I didn't have good staff, but because it was not an iterative process. It wasn't something that we both talked about. It was much more paperwork that was filled out on the other side. And partly because when I raised questions, I wasn't sure that the staff who were there were really wanting to hear from a patient at that time. So there's a timing issue of how do you get your entire staff to see that having patients involved in our back of the house stuff is actually beneficial and can be helpful, as opposed to who are these people coming in here trying to think they could tell me what to do. The fourth, I actually have had not as much involvement in it, but I think it's important to talk about the patient experience at Michigan Medicine, and that is, as many of you might do, you have short huddles where the staff get together, sometime during the week or maybe more frequently, depending on how you do this, with some sort of whiteboard, and then it's often a quality improvement plan, and it's assuring that, did the code that was done today done appropriately? Were there any other issues that took place that we need to talk about? This was often a staff-only bulletin board. Again, when I was there, it was something I would see as I became an advisory board member. We'd say, well, what is that? And we raised the question of, well, what if you shifted this from being a heads-up huddle board that just the staff talked about to put it right in front and center? So when patients come in, they'd have an opportunity to see what is it that you're working on in terms of quality and safety for patients, and how might you actually work with us to enhance what is our safety program or our quality program might be. And that, I think, continues to be something that's being worked on, but the folks at Michigan, I think, are getting to a place where, more than half the people who show up to experience those 5-10 minute huddles are patients who have lots of perspectives, and it brings an entire new perspective to what it is that it means to be a participant in their program. The fifth is, again, something I've had only small amount of work with, and that is trying to get peer mentors to be a part. So those of us who are cardiac rehab graduates to come back, to give back to the folks and work with current patients to say, how might I be helpful with somebody who was equally as scared as I was when I walked into cardiac rehab, to have somebody who's already been through this and is on the other side, who has a similar experience, has had an SCA, has a couple of stents, who can help me to see, hey, the other side looks a lot better. You're going to be really pleased about this. The program is really effective. Here's the research I know about it. And so these peer mentors have been trained and worked really well, I think, to do that. And then the final one I will talk about that has already happened is the orientation I described in the first of shifting to be much more human-centered and connected via community now has, I think I've done it 4 times, and my colleague, another patient, has done this maybe more than this now, have begun to do orientation part 2, which is to have patients be co-leading that. So what a really interesting experience. And all of you who have gone to other healthcare, can you imagine walking in to learn about your healthcare situation and seeing fellow patients there, somebody who, again, can talk about this from there is an other side of this. You will actually get to phase 3, and phase 3 has lots of ways in which you'll think about how do you thrive post these cardiac events. And we're still working on testing to see, do patients who come in and get co-led by other patients do better? Are their outcomes better? Do they stay and participate the entire time? Do they complete the program? We don't know the answers to that, and it doesn't require a massive amount of research, but it's an opportunity for us as we see. So that's what we see, and in the future I'll talk about in a moment. So there's a point about saying, oh, okay, this all sounds great, Greg. We sort of already do this. I know my patients. We're great. What the heck is so new about this? So I'm going to give you an opportunity to try some things out. And so in the chat box, I'm going to give you an opportunity to talk about a current issue that does exist, and try to go through a way in which a patient would look at the things that you're going to describe. So if you see here, so in the chat box, if you go over as you look at this and put in to organizers only and check that box, and then if you'll put in what is one current issue that your program that you'd love to do at least experiment, a small tiny experiment on, or to change, and that might be everything from an enrollment issue that's going on, a staffing issue that's taking place, that you got to get outcomes for patients to get better, or you want to improve your orientation. So if you wouldn't mind beginning to put into that chat area so that I can take a look at some of these and begin to have a sort of virtual conversation with you. So you go down to the chat, hit organizers only, and then plug in there. So let me just take a crack at some things here. So let me just do an overall first. So it is terrible that you have so many issues, and not surprising, because of course you would, because programs are going to have this. So here's the sort of meta conversation I think you'd want to have, is that how much of these issues have you raised with your patients, and particularly with patients who actually don't have any understanding of how healthcare operates. Okay, 1 to 8 staff patient ratio. Indeed, that's a great example of how a patient would look at that, is going to look at this in a different way. So one might be, it sounds like you need to have more staff, and so one simple solution might, not a solution, one simple response might be, what if you engaged a couple of patients who are your favorite patients to raise the issue about how concerning is that? Why is that an issue? What could we do as patients to go talk to the leadership about the idea that that seems to be too many, and here's why? All the reasons why that would be the case. So again, I think that so this notion of can staff work with more than one patient at a time, and some patients are resistant. Certainly going to be some patients resistant, but part of that is the process by which you set up, how much we set up the expectation for patients, that if you set expectations up in certain ways, it turns out that people begin to behave in that way. And so if you shift that thinking, it may have something that's quite different. Oh gosh, there are a lot of wonderful things here that I would love to go in, but for the sake of time, I won't. So again, I'll stay with this. These are wonderful things. Keep them. So all of you have them, and begin the process of trying to solve them by saying to yourself, who is the one or two patients, I'm already working on this issue, that actually I could contact and begin asking them what would be their solution to this. So just that simple step might create some way to change this. So let me move to, so here are some things that haven't happened. So I'll just give you my examples of 3 little tiny experiments. And this is hyperlinked now in this, and because it's a good example of, some of you may have heard about the notion of 10,000 hours of practice makes you an expert in something. And this is sort of a counter to that, and saying 10,000 experiments could make you really something that begins to change and transform and create creative ways to solve some problems that you've been banging your head against the wall that requires somebody who thinks differently than you to try to think about new ways to do so. So I'll tell you 3 things that I've actually talked to the folks at Michigan Medicine. We've done none of these things because for lots of reasons, but we've done none of them. So the first is, and they go from more simple to more complex and come from this tiny brain who does work in education mostly. And the first is, how do you do your blood pressure, taking blood pressure before and after? Some of you may already be in a circle, and that'd be great, and I want to talk to you about that. But most of you, I suspect, have some sort of line. It's more efficient. You have yourself or someone go down the line and take that blood pressure and report it out to the folks. So what if one of the things you did is just did a little what's often known as A/B experiment. So you did Monday, Wednesday, and Friday does exactly the way you've always done it, and Tuesday and Thursday you change and make the place where you create the blood pressure a circle. And in that circle there's a table that sits in the very middle of that stuff. And in that middle of stuff is a question. And that question might just be, what's your favorite movie? To much more revealing as you get to know people in that community. And here's why I think this is really important. One is you check to see whether there's any difference in the metrics. Do people stay longer because they've made this connection in their class and you're reinforcing that over and over? But probably more importantly is, I actually believe that one of the things that cardiac rehab underutilizes is trying to solve what I think is maybe one of the more pressing problems that exist in our society. And that is that folks who end up in cardiac rehab are often folks who are lonely and in social isolation, and that's actually as much a killer as anything else. And so how might we create an opportunity to build bonds in our classrooms so that these patients get to know each other and spend 36 sessions together and then find their way to see each other long beyond that. Again, it's not for everybody, and you wouldn't have to answer the question in the middle, but it would be an opportunity to begin to grow as a community. This notion of ITPs, which I know are a bane of so many of your existence, but I actually think about this a little differently. What if there was an opportunity to do a pair treatment plan or a duo treatment plan, whatever you wanted to call it? And you could do this either at the very beginning by saying, we're trying this experiment and seeing if you would like to share all of your information with your buddy here, we're happy to connect you with each other. Because what I believe the treatment plan needs to be about is that there are motivational ways in which this can happen. So there's lots of research that shows about the benefits of having 2 of us. In fact, most of us who do exercise or have done exercise have a workout buddy. And so how would we create a pair treatment plan where not just you, but your 2 people who you're working with know each other's stuff and are trying to help you to get better with whatever the treatment plan is being planned. And I get the HIPAA stuff, and so you'd need to work on a way to assure your legal team says, yeah, of course you can do that. These are folks who are together who have agreed to share their information. And then the third gets much more complex, but what if you were able to do 2 things at once? One is to find and build a class where they come in together, meaning they all had cardiac events in the last 2 weeks, and you built a way in which logistics could work so that that group came together. And what if in that class you were able to work with local restaurant vendors and were able to create T-shirts that bonded that group of class members together, and you then did a series of experiments to see, do people who actually have T-shirts together, are in the same class, have gotten this connection, do they do better, do they stay longer than the way in which we run our program now that doesn't have that sort of connectedness? And so I have a series of these sorts of things in my blog that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of having patients become more connected in community. So if that's of interest to you, or if you have other questions about this, I'll take those at the end. So let me just, before we get to a chance to get some questions in the last 10 minutes or so, talk a little about some cautions and caveats about this. And so probably the most important one is to work on defensiveness that exists. So I've raised this point many, many times to many different staff members in all kinds of healthcare arenas now. And unfortunately, one of the first things that comes up is a series of sort of defensiveness that takes place, that it's hard for healthcare to be seen as vulnerable, that they actually don't have everything all together, and that we don't want to tell our patients that because they'll think we're actually incompetent. And I'm here to say that if we're really going to build trust, that's the patient has already become the most vulnerable they can be, and they're working on trusting you. And how might you be able to say, hey, we don't have the back of the house in perfect order either, and we need your help, and we're trying to work this so that we partner. So working on the defensiveness that takes place in your own head as you think about these ideas, and certainly if you're a program manager, how you make certain that the entire staff sees this as something that is beneficial to them, and the return on investment is one that will make the program better and at minimally help you to become more connected to the patients. And then the second thing on the patient side is being quite careful about this notion of tokenism of patients. So what I think doesn't work well at all is for patients to feel like they're being brought into this at the 11th hour. They really don't care about my opinion. What they'd like is my vote to say that I was a patient who said, yes, that's a great looking brochure. And that we're ready to hear that if patients are brought in at that stage, you might very well get that. But if they're brought in at the place where you're truly trying to co-create what takes place, then I think you do the opposite of tokenizing, but literally allow them to feel like there's real intrinsic motivation for grateful patients to give back and to feel like, wow, I've really done something that is phenomenal. So, and remember, it's not all going to be perfect. There are going to be things that simply won't work, and your goal is to improve your program, and that's, if you keep that in mind, that's going to be incredibly helpful. So we are at the 8 minutes to go in this at this point. So I've really in some ways just scratched the surface about this, and there's so much more work to be done, and I love the fact that you had all these opportunities to think about issues or concerns that exist in ways in which me as a patient, and certainly you finding other patients like me, to look at the problems that exist in your program and try to work together to authentically partner to solve those. But if you want to have some more opportunity to do this in person, myself and we hope Patrick Walden will be at the annual meeting doing the session called Backseat Leadership, the Triumphs and Challenges of Sharing Leadership with Your Patients, and give you much more practical ways in which to keep working on this. So save the date for that. And I think it's at this point I can begin to take any questions. Hannah, I've read this point here because I think it's a really important one. I'll do my best to answer, but might have to invoke the three hardest words for all of us to say. It turns out that is not I love you or I hate you, but it's that I don't know. It turns out that most of us actually want to have an answer even if we really don't know, and so we spout off an answer that may not be even what we believe, and so I'm going to do my best to answer them, but I might very well say I don't know. And generally I think questions are really critical. In the resources section, I give you a book that I really care a lot about called The More Beautiful Question. But I think if I do anything but to spur you on to begin to ask more questions like, should we have a patient in this forum right now? That's the kind of thing that I hope will take place, and that you do create a culture of curiosity in your program or continue the one that already exists there. Okay, Hannah, you may want to give some opportunity for questions.
Absolutely. So Greg, it looks like folks are continuing to submit questions through this question field. So feel free to scroll along with me if you'd like. Folks, we have about 5 minutes on the line, but if you have follow-up questions, definitely feel free to reach out to AACVPR, or Greg has provided his contact information as well. It looks like there's a lot of concerns about cooperation with medical staff and inpatient referred to outpatient CR. Is that something you could touch on?
So which one is that?
It looks like this is one of the ones that was submitted recently at around 12:43.
I actually don't see that. So say more what it is, because I actually don't seem to see it here.
There's a concern from an attendee about no cooperation with the medical staff of inpatient referred to outpatient cardiac rehab.
Oh, great. Right. So in some ways that's an issue question, right? So it's, again, it goes to the notion of, okay, how might I get a patient? So I'll tell you, if Patrick said to me that that's actually one of the major issues that happens at Michigan Medicine, I would ask, well, how might a patient go and talk to whoever the leadership is there and say, hey, as a patient who has graduated from here, if this is causing a problem for other patients not being able to get to cardiac rehab, I'd love to talk with whoever's there. So I don't have any stake in the politics. So one of the things that happens far too often in healthcare is that the politics that exist between folks, because somebody has more status than somebody else, and I understand cardiac rehab is often the sort of bad stepchild, and maybe that's true for pulmonary as well. But patients who care deeply about this, whose lives have been affected by this, would be ones to say, hey, listen, I have no interest in whatever the politics are. I'm here to tell you that we've got to figure out a way. And in my case, somebody who works in education, I'd work on the training side of this. But if you found a patient who is much more an engineer, they might figure out a way in which they can, or an information technologist, a way in which you'd say, well, why can't you do this? Why can't you create this online process that allows this communication? I don't have the answers to that, but I'm certain that there are going to be patients who you've worked with that would have such a response.
Okay, it looks like we have additional questions regarding education class attendance. How can patients be encouraged to attend classes on a more regular basis?
So I think, here's again one of the places where I think building community will matter. So there is a cognitive bias that we all have that if the bandwagon effect happens, we all sort of jump on the bandwagon, and that's literally what the cognitive bias is. And so I would argue that one of the most important things to do is to find the patients who do go there, who are regular attendees who believe it, and have them talk about why they go with other patients. If you're struggling to have that, talk about what they get out of this. So make this much more a partnership where both of us are working on this. So the staff is saying, you all need to do this, and this is a very sort of paternalistic way in which healthcare operates. And patients might say, actually, we're not going to do that, but if here's why I think it would really be helpful. So the more you co-create what the educational sessions look like with patients, the more likely that patient's going to be one who would say to other patients, you should really go to this thing. It's really, really helpful. I've learned more in this 4-minute session than I have in any other thing before.
Thank you. In the last remaining minutes, we've had several questions about staff to patient ratio, if group orientations are successful, or if that one-on-one contact is necessary. Is this something that you could speak to further?
Well, I'll say a little about group orientation, why I think it's successful. Again, I'll go back to the notion that though there are lots of individual treatment, individual programs will give to individual patients, but I think that initial group orientation, why it's so beneficial, is because so most of what I'm doing when I show up after a cardiac event is be frightened and wonder what the heck is going to happen next. And the moment that I get connected to other patients who I can see are like me, the more I become at ease at thinking, okay, I'm going to be able to get through this. I'm going to be able to go through it, not just because I have the staff who are wonderfully expertise, but I have other patients like me who either have gone through it, in my case, when I go back and lead orientation, or in cases where patients who are participating do get a chance to help each other and be able to say, hey, I'm here. In fact, I can still remember that the group of guys that I got connected with were in the locker room. They weren't formally community built out in the floor. But I started to care by session 12 whether Bob was going to come, and if he wasn't there, I wondered where he was. And so helping on both, from enrollment to continuing to participate to learning about more about why it matters to come to all sessions, much of that stuff is happening informally, and how might we formally do that by engaging patients in a very different way.
Thank you. So it looks like we are at the top of the hour. Do you have any closing thoughts or messages that you want the attendees to take away? I
do. So I have one final request, if you all wouldn't mind. So I have just started. I believe there's something about cardiac rehab graduates that we just have not utilized well. And so I have just started a Facebook group, thanks to the couple of you who've already joined, where you could spread the word as well. What I'm hoping to do with this is to get cardiac rehab graduates into one space with staff members who work in the field and with students who are thinking about going into the field, and begin to have a conversation where we can talk about what would be ideas to solve many of the issues that you raise. So using social media and Facebook in a way that's beneficial, that may create a wonderful learning environment. And then finally, there's a sign up to my blog, and so if you just show up at patientandpartner.com and sign up there, you'll get some more information where I talk about both cardiac rehab and other parts of healthcare where we're trying to work on partnering authentically helps. And then you'll see a whole series of resources that hopefully will be helpful to those of you who have as well.
Thank you so much for your time today, Greg, for sharing your experiences and your expertise in this area. It's very much appreciated. Attendees, please feel free to reach out for follow-up questions and utilize these resources. Handouts are available to download directly from the GoToWebinar toolbar, or feel free to reach out to AACVPR, and we're happy to provide those as well. Also, be sure to save the date for the AACVPR annual meeting, and you can meet and chat with Greg in person. Everyone, thank you so much for attending, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.